Turning overseas now to the quaint British city, now swarming with hazmat suits. The new surveillance images coming in tonight of a spy and his daughter apparently poisoned. ABC's Jennifer Eccleston with the latest.
Tonight, new surveillance video capturing the moments just before a Russian spy and his daughter collapsed, poisoned on the brink of death. Watch as this man and woman, believed to be Sergey Skripal and his daughter Yulia, walk casually in Salisbury, England last Sunday. Minutes later, police discovering the pair comatose on this nearby bench. British authorities say the poison, a very rare nerve toxin. Tonight, they're still fighting for their lives as more than 250 counterterrorism police widen the crime scene across this normally quiet city.
We want explanations.
Hazmat teams blocking off the graves of Skripal's wife and son, tents protecting potential evidence. Chemical warfare troops hunting for possible contamination. So far, more than 200 witnesses questioned.
This is a serious, substantial investigation.
Sergei Skripal was a former Russian spy turned double agent for the British, convicted in Russia and released to the UK in a spy swap. British government officials calling the attempted assassination outrageous. Tom, investigators not naming suspects yet, but some lawmakers here already blaming Moscow, noting Russia has a history of using poisons against alleged traitors.
4 years to the day since the annexation of Crimea, Vladimir Putin urging his people to vote. Despite consternation abroad, he's about to win another term, though now accused of another serious transgression. Personally ordering the assassination of an ex-Russian spy on British soil.
Our quarrel is with Putin's Kremlin and with his decision. And we think it overwhelmingly likely that it was his decision to direct the use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK, on the streets of Europe.
It is a significant escalation in what's been a sharp exchange since the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia, who remain in critical condition. Western leaders have lined up to echo Britain in accusing Russia. But in naming Putin now, this has become personal. And a shameful, groundless game, says Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. But it isn't far-fetched, according to Russia critics. 2 years ago, a British public inquiry into the poisoning by polonium of another ex-Russian spy here in London concluded it was probably approved by Putin. And there are those here who believe Putin stood to gain from Skripal's assassination.
He's saying don't mess with Russia. This was really useful for the election. It added a real note of sizzle to the end of what had been otherwise a very lacklustre campaign. But it also is very useful for the future because it shows that Russia is back and the West is too divided to do anything about it.
Moscow has denied involvement, with some accusing Britain of orchestrating the attack, maybe to meddle in Russia's election. Their exchange now crowded with tension. We are ready to play a long game, the results of which won't be very pleasant for the British side, says Russia's ambassador here, Alexander Yakovenko. Putin, meanwhile, is certain to win that election, and so his long standoff with the West nowhere near over. Nala Ayed, CBC News, London.
A very rare nerve agent. That's what the UK's Interior Minister says was used to poison a former Russian spy and his daughter. It follows a number of mysterious deaths in the UK in recent years of people linked to Russia, which flatly denies any involvement. So, what are the implications of this latest attack? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. The poisoning of former Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia follows several mysterious deaths of Russians in Britain. Many of them had been living in the UK and had made allegations against Russian President Vladimir Putin or his country's security services. Those allegations often included state involvement in political assassinations, killings of civilians in bombings, and running multi-million-dollar corruption rackets. Alexander Litvinenko, a former Russian intelligence officer who later worked with MI6 in the UK, died in November 2006, just weeks after drinking tea that was poisoned with radioactive polonium. A British public inquiry found that he was killed by 2 Russian agents, probably with the approval of President Putin. Russian businessman Alexander Perepilichny died in 2012 after collapsing while jogging near his home in Surrey. His death was at first attributed to natural causes, but an autopsy later found traces of poison in his stomach. He'd been investigating a huge money laundering scheme connected to Russian officials. And Boris Berezovsky, a former Russian billionaire and vocal critic of President Putin, was found dead in his home near London in 2013. Police could not determine if he'd committed suicide or was murdered. Well, the poisoning of the Russian father and daughter comes at a time when Russian relations with the UK and the West are at their worst level since the end of the Cold War. In a moment, we'll hear from our guests. But before we do, let's find out what's being said about this case in Russia. Our Moscow correspondent, Rory Challens, reports.
Well, the line from both the Kremlin and the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is that this is all an anti-Russian media campaign and that they have very little information. London has not actually approached them yet for any assistance in the matter. The inevitable comparisons with the poisoning to death of former spy Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006, well, those have only been strengthened by comments made by one of the men wanted by UK authorities for that murder. Now, Andrei Lugovoy was never extradited to face any charges in Britain. In fact, he was made a member of parliament here in Russia. He says that Britons suffer from phobias. And watchers of Russian state TV have also noticed a kind of nod, wink, wink attitude to the coverage, with the suggestion being that being a traitor is one of the most dangerous things you can be, and perhaps these people shouldn't move to the UK. Clearly something's going wrong there because there have been so many strange cases recently with grave outcomes. And if this was a state hit, that's of course exactly the kind of message that would be intended. Don't be a traitor, it can be fatal.
All right, let's bring in our guests for today's programme. From London, we're joined by Bill Browder, CEO and co-founder of Hermitage Capital Management. From Brussels, Annie Machon, former MI5 intelligence officer. And also in London, Samuel Green, director of the Russia Institute at King's College, London. Thank you all for being with us on today's Inside Story. Bill, let's start with you. What's your take on the Skripal poisoning? Who might be responsible? How was it done? What was the motive?
Well, let's look at the facts as we know them so far. We have Mr. Skripal was an enemy of Russia. He was considered to be a traitor by Putin after becoming a double agent to the UK. He has been felled along with his 33-year-old daughter with a poison. The poison has been determined to be some type of chemical weapon, a nerve agent. So what can we conclude from this? We can conclude that an enemy of Russia has been poisoned with a nerve agent that only a state could get its hands on. And therefore, I would conclude on the basis of this information that the highest likelihood candidate for having done this is the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin. Sorry, I'm saying that the highest probability theory is that Vladimir Putin is behind this.
All right. Bill, you say the highest probability that Putin is behind this. Could there be any other way of looking at it? We've got a presidential election coming up in days in Russia. Could another state actor or perhaps a crime organization who want to cause trouble for Putin have been behind this? I'm thinking if you talk about state actors, Ukraine, for instance.
Well, so first of all, let's talk about the second theory that somehow it's a mafia hit. The mafia doesn't have access to chemical weapons. The mafia, also the Russian mafia, would be absolutely terrified to do anything that would make Putin unhappy because he's head of that mafia organization. And as far as Ukraine goes, I've never heard such a nonsense in my life. Ukraine wouldn't do something like this. This is there are basically three countries that could do this. It was North Korea, who has chemical weapons and have used them. It's Syria with Assad that has chemical weapons and uses them, and Russia that has chemical weapons and uses them. Those are the three countries. Now, this man wasn't an enemy to North Korea. He wasn't an enemy to Syria. He's an enemy to Russia.
Annie, he was living quite openly in the UK. Would he have been protected by the security services in the UK or have had any contact with them?
I'm sure, as he was a valued MI6 asset for over 10 years, that he would have had contact. There would certainly be someone still looking after him, keeping an overview of his case. However, I think we need to get the terminology right here. One, he was not a double agent. He was a British agent who betrayed Russia because he worked for MI6, and he was paid to do that over a decade. He was caught by the Russian state in 2006, and he was tried and he was convicted and then sentenced to 13 years in prison. The only reason he was back in the UK is because he was part of a spy swap in 2010. I don't know if you remember the sleeper organisation, allegedly, that was discovered in the USA, including Anna Chapman, and they were swapped back to Russia in return for 4 Western spies, and Skripal was one of them. So he was pardoned by Russia, and he was allowed to go free, which would indicate that they didn't feel that he could do any harm to the Russian state once he'd been handed over to the UK. Also, in these spy swaps, MI6, as his handlers, would have spent weeks debriefing him as much as they could, and then they would have given him a pension and allowed him to live freely in the UK, which is precisely what we saw. So, in terms of the Russian state seeing him as an enemy, I think they would see him as a traitor, sure, but, a traitor that could do no more harm. So I think, rather than look at his ancient history, what the intelligence agencies in the UK now, and the police in the UK now will be doing, is looking at his most recent history over the last 8 years since he's been living in the UK. What he's been working on, who he's been working with, who his contacts are, because from that they'll probably find evidence, or at least information, about who might have carried out this attack at a very sensitive time in our diplomatic relations with Russia.
There are media reports which the Russian embassy in the UK flatly denies that he was having monthly meetings at the Russian embassy. There are other media reports that he'd become friendly with a British security consultant who worked for Christopher Steele, the former MI6 agent behind the Trump dossier that makes alleged connections between presidential candidate and businessman Trump, as he was then, and Russia, and allegations of collusion. Could that be anything to do with it? Was he really involved in something quite murky?
It's difficult to tell. I mean, certainly I saw the report in the Times a couple of days ago that suggested that he might have been one of the sources used by Christopher Steele in pulling together what is now called the dirty dossier on Donald Trump. So that would bring in other players, potentially, either state level or rogue state level, who might have an interest in the outcome of this man and his life. So I think, at this point, immediately to start jumping up and down and say, it must be Russia, it must be Russia, I think is ingenuous at best, and actually rather dangerous at quite a sensitive time in diplomatic relationships at worst.
Samuel Green, why was Skripal targeted and by whom?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that the reality is we don't know the strength of the system that we have here in the UK. It's a rule of law based system, right? So I think we do need to let this system come up through an investigative process with information that clearly we don't have, and what Bill described at the outset, does seem to point in a certain direction, and really almost everybody, obviously, who's looked at this has come to what seems at the moment to be the logical conclusion, right? That Russia is the most likely candidate, and yet, right, we don't actually have any evidence that's taking us in that direction that would ever stand up in a court of law, to say nothing of sort of the court of public opinion and diplomatic back and forth, right? So we will learn things as we go. Clearly we don't know. Mr. Skripal, unlike some people, unlike Litvinenko before him, has kept his head down, relatively speaking, at least, and so it is difficult to really have anything other than fairly wild speculation about what might have put him in the crosshairs at this particular moment in time.
All right, we'll try not to speculate too much then. But okay, what do you make of the timing of this incident? I mean, here we are, just days away now from the Russian presidential election, which Vladimir Putin is all but certain to win.
Right, and I think broadly for that reason, I don't buy the argument that has cropped up in some places that this was done in order to help shore up Putin's electoral chances. I mean, the reality is, as you said, he was not going to have any difficulty in that race on the 18th of March. He has, of course, built his campaign around, as a central theme, a threat and confrontation with the West. The idea that given that Russia, for all intents and purposes, is at war with the West on various fronts, that this is not the time to change your leadership, right? But that message has been driven home fairly quickly and really does not require something like this to reinforce it. I'm not sure, that when you look at this sort of thing, if you're going to attack somebody in a foreign country, I don't know that there's ever a better or a worse time to do it. So I wouldn't probably read too much into the timing question.
Bill Browder, to what extent is the fact that no one has been apprehended? I mean, I know there are suspects and extradition requests that have been refused, but no one's been apprehended for the Litvinenko murder. To what extent is that given those who would wish to do away with political opponents the confidence to do so on British soil?
Well, I think it's crucial. So you had a dramatic and unbelievable situation in 2006. Alexander Litvinenko, who was a British citizen at the time, was killed by Russia using nuclear materials, which was proven by a high court judge in a public inquiry. And what was the consequence? What did Britain do to Russia? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so if you're Vladimir Putin and you're a guy who orders the liquidation and hit of enemies, traitors, and other people in your own country and in the West, and you find a Western country, Great Britain, that does absolutely nothing when you do a nuclear assassination, the message to you is you can do whatever you want. And that's not the only hit that Vladimir Putin and the FSB have done in the UK. There have been a number of other deaths, including the death of Alexander Perpolichny, who was a Russian whistleblower who blew the whistle on a massive FSB financial scam, and he dropped dead at the age of 44 in front of his house in Weybridge, Surrey. The police refused to even investigate it as a murder. And so from my perspective and from the perspective of Vladimir Putin, this is a country where assassinations can be carried out without any consequence. And that, I believe, was a huge policy failure, which has led to the situation we're in right now with Mr. Skripal and his daughter hanging on for dear life in a Salisbury hospital.
Bill, you've become an enemy of Vladimir Putin. You're not Russian, but you've received death threats. Does what happened in Salisbury a few days ago give you pause for thought? Are you safe in Britain?
I don't believe I'm safe in Britain at all. If you look at the situation, as I said, they can go around, the Russian government can go around killing with impunity. But the main thing that gives me pause going forward is not the Russians' actions. We know what they're capable of. What gives me pause is what the British response is going to be. If the British government doesn't respond forcefully and decisively in a way that really creates consequences for the Putin regime after this assassination attempt, then it's not safe for anybody who has anything bad to say about Russia to live in the UK.
All right, I want to get on to the politics of all of this in just a moment. But Annie, first of all, let's talk about the investigation. I mean, obviously, there's a lot that we, the public, will not be privy to. In fact, we'll probably never know. But what is actually going on right now in terms of the investigation into this incident?
Well, if I was sitting behind a desk in MI5 now, I think I'd be trying to coordinate 3 prongs of investigation. The first one is the people on the street. You know, the call has gone out for anyone who is in the city centre at that time, and they might think they know nothing, but to give their statement to the police. And also the police will need to go through all the CCTV. The other one, of course, and, hats off to the UK agencies that they discovered what the substance was so quickly, because that is core evidence, is to try and narrow it down to precisely what type of nerve agent it was, because that will give an indication about what sort of laboratories around the world might be producing that specific nerve agent, and how it might be acquired either legitimately or over the dark web. But the key thing as well is to get a warrant and go through his computers, his phone calls, his phone records, everything, which I presume they've already done because they are in his house at the moment, to try and work out exactly what he's been involved in over the last 8 years. Because, as I said, he was a busted flush when it came to intelligence. If he'd been handed over voluntarily by the Russians, if he'd been pardoned by the Russians, he was taken into the UK and questioned by MI6. There is nothing really intelligence-wise that can be taken or gained by either side. So it would suggest to me very, very strongly that this attack is something to do with what he might have been working on over the last 8 years. I would also like to argue against the idea that this is equivalent to the Litvinenko case, because this guy had been pardoned by the Russians. He was allowed to come to the UK. He was given safe haven and a pension by MI6. He was not a threat. Litvinenko was a very different case because we had someone who has fled to the UK for protection. He was an active dissident, an active whistleblower, and an active, at the time of his death, consultant for MI6. So he had been seen as much more of an enemy of the state than someone who had been pardoned by the state and allowed to leave that state. So yes, I can understand the police response being very rapid because they, as soon as you flag up the name and the history would have sent up a red flag. Of course they would have responded in the same way as they might have done in the Litvinenko case. They would have been worried about it to protect public safety. But the equivalence stops there.
Bill, do you want to come back on that? That you can't compare the Skripal and the Litvinenko cases?
I think. Well, I think that's an extremely narrow and unhelpful analysis. That what everybody has to understand about Vladimir Putin is that he is trying to keep in line many hundreds of thousands of security service officials, intelligence officers, army people, and none of them are motivated by ideology. This is not a communist regime. It's not a religious regime. It's effectively a kleptocracy regime. And so his only way of motivating people is through money. Is through giving people the opportunity to steal money, to shake people down, to extort people. And that's how people in his government that's how he's kept people loyal. But the money is running out. Oil prices are down, sanctions are biting. There's not as much money to go around anymore. And so he's got to deal with people who no longer have the main motivation to stay loyal. And in that situation, the main tool that he has to keep them loyal is absolute fear. And the way to create absolute fear is to take a traitor like Mr. Skripal and say, we're going to kill this traitor. And not only are we going to kill him, we're going to kill his family members, and we're going to kill them in the most horrible public way. And if anyone else decides they want to step out of line, they're going to be killed in the same horrible way as well. That is the way he creates loyalty. His audience is not anybody else other than his own security services, and that's probably the main motivation for what has happened here today. And to say that Mr. Skripal was working on something...
I have to jump in here, Bill.
Go ahead, Annie.
I have to jump in here, Bill. Sorry. This is very insulting to all the people who work in intelligence agencies and other security forces around the world.
When did you work in the intelligence agencies?
If you work for MI5 or MI6 in the UK...
You worked there 20 years ago.
In the 90s.
And 25 years ago.
I was going to make a point, if you'd allow me to.
You worked there.
Allow me to make a point then. How is the timing relevant? So I joined up, not for the pay, not for the money. I joined because I actually had a sense of wanting to do something that was worthwhile, something that could help protect my fellow citizens. And this was at the height of the IRA bombing campaign in London. And I think, you do a great disservice, Bill. You've got an incredibly cynical view that everything's always about money. It's not. It might have been in the case of Skripal, because, of course, he did get about $100,000
I know a lot about
But most people go into this work
because I know how they've been dealing with money. I know exactly what the Putin regime is up to because I'm engaged with them in a full-on fight about them stealing money, about Vladimir Putin being involved in a major multi-hundred million dollar theft. And so I know exactly what's going on as of today. You're talking about 25 years ago in your own experience.
Okay, and Annie, just quickly, I need to get Samuel back.
I was talking about 20 years ago, and actually, I'm quite aware, Bill, that you have been banned from Russia, from the Russian Federation, for over a decade because you were one of the Chicago economists who went in to asset strip the country and were banned. Apparently,
I was banned for exposing corruption in Russia. If you know anything about my story. I've been convicted by Russian on tax fraud after exposing them for stealing $230 million.
Okay, all right. Look, let's move the discussion on because time is tight here. Samuel Green, UK's defence minister, says that Russia is becoming an ever greater threat. Russia's being assertive. Russia's being aggressive. He said, while being careful not to blame Russia for the Skripal attack. And we have to change the way in which we deal with it because we can't be pushed around by another nation. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I think we have to look at that in the round. The reality is that defense spending in this country has been cut rather dramatically in recent years, and it doesn't look to improve. And so, to a certain extent, he's doing what defense ministers do in terms of lobbying for a budget, and certainly there are arguments to be made, and important arguments to be made about what Russia has done, particularly in the European space, in Ukraine. Obviously, we've seen the rhetoric out of Moscow recently with new missile systems and things like that. So there are responses. There is a degree of hyperbole to it when we hear things about the prospect of shutting down cyber networks and energy systems and transport systems and other sort of vital infrastructure in the UK. But what this all speaks to is, on the one hand, a recognition of Russia's capabilities, which should not be surprising to anybody, right? But also really no trust whatsoever in Russia's intentions, right? From a governmental standpoint, from a societal standpoint, from the standpoint of the media in this country, right? It is very easy to come to the immediate assumptions and conclusions about Russia's alleged role in this case and in other cases like it. Simply because the track record that we've seen from Russia and the state of the relationship is such that it really leaves very little doubt in people's minds. Right.
Okay.
Having said that, right, the response to this, right, is not likely to be a military response, a defense response, and it's not likely to be, if it's going to be effective, any kind of response that the UK can take on its own. It's going to require allies.
Okay. Bill, if Russian involvement in this case is confirmed by British authorities, Anglo-Russian relations are already pretty strained at the moment. Given that Britain's already imposed sanctions and expelled diplomats, what could the UK do to punish Russia?
Well, this is where there's a big opportunity. One of the things which the UK has a huge leverage in one area, which is that the Russian government officials and Kremlin-connected oligarchs come to London, buy properties in large sizes all over the most expensive districts of London. And they value those properties, they covet those properties. And the one thing that can be done, and is now possible to do based on the law, is for the UK government to seize those properties. And believe me, the government doesn't care. The Russian government doesn't care about a few diplomats being expelled. They don't care about an exercisable extradition of their officials. What they care about is if their house on Belgrave Square gets confiscated. And that's what the government should do. And if they do that, it will go immediately right up to Putin. And Putin will understand that this is a place where you can't mess with anymore because there's real consequences. At the moment, Putin doesn't think there's any consequences. And in countries where there are consequences, he doesn't do this type of thing. And so I'm recommending, and I know many other members of parliament are recommending, that the Magnitsky Act should be imposed aggressively in response to this occasion.
I'm afraid we're out of time. The news waits for no one. We've got to wrap it up. Many thanks indeed to all of you, Bill Browder, Annie Mashon, and Samuel Green.